The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamuk, Serrano, Kalia, Teompuicham, Hashaman, Ifai-Tipai, Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement, we direct you to the USC History Department website. Their faculty have authored detailed and contextual land acknowledgement. For our audience on Zoom, we would love to know where you're watching from, so feel free to let us know in the chat. And if you know what Indigenous territory you're on, we welcome you sharing that as well. And please remember in the chat, you have an option where you can make your message visible to just hosts and panelists or to everybody. You can choose which you like. I'm just going to stop sharing for the introductions, Carli, and then you can reshare when you. So my name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And on behalf of the Center and the USC Shoah Foundation, who are joining us in presenting this lecture, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you. Since we have a sizable audience joining us online, I just want to give a note about the Zoom protocols. We will have time for questions and discussion, so we invite and encourage your participation, your questions and comments in the chat, and especially using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. You can also ask questions on audio, should you be so brave, by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom also, and we will call on you. When considering how to ask your question, just please be aware that the event is being recorded and will be made widely available afterwards. So should you have concerns about privacy or anonymity, you might want to choose your method of questions, but we certainly invite and encourage you to ask them. And my colleague Maya will be moderating the questions from the chat and the Q&A feature. I'd like to welcome our in-person audience as well. Welcome to the first event of the spring 2023 semester. Somewhere floating in the back, we have a flyer of all our upcoming events for the spring, so we hope that we will see you again. But now to introduce today's lecture and today's speaker, I will introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Gruner.
Thank you, Martha, and also Maya for all the work which went into the preparation of this talk. And welcome everybody here, especially the students and also staff members of the Shoah Foundation and everybody out there kind of in the virtual realm. I want to just first introduce the fellowship and the institutions and then the speaker for today. So the USC Shoah Foundation Robert Katz Research Fellowship in Genocide Studies is named after a longtime volunteer and former USC Shoah Foundation Board of Counselor member, Chair Robert J. Katz, in recognition of his service to the Shoah Foundation. The Katz Fellowship is awarded annually to an outstanding, advanced standing PhD candidate, Carli, this time, from any discipline for dissertation research focused on testimony from the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. The Katz Fellowship enables the recipient to spend 1 month in residency at the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research and the USC Shoah Foundation. The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research was founded in 2014, previously named the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. It has concentrated, or is concentrating, its effort on developing an innovative interdisciplinary research agenda focusing on 3 under-researched areas, which are resistance to mass violence, violence, emotion, and individual behavior, and digital genocide studies. The center manages and organizes a rich academic program, each year holding an international conference, hosting numerous fellows and scholars, visiting scholars in residence, and organizing workshops, lecture series as this one here. The USC Shoah Foundation was founded in 1994, and their mission is to develop empathy, understanding, and respect through testimony. The Institute's efforts are rooted in the Visual History Archive, a repository containing over 55,000 testimonies now of survivors and witnesses, mainly of the Holocaust, but also of other genocides and crimes against humanity. The USC Shoah Foundation's program focuses on the preserving and expanding their testimony collections, education through strategic partnerships, research on the history and prevention of genocide, and global outreach through compelling stories from the Visual History Archive. Okay, now this is done. I finally want to come to the actual important introduction today. This is, we are welcoming Carli Snyder. She is a PhD candidate in history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and she studies with Dagmar Herzog. She earned her MA and her MPhil in history at the City University of New York, and her BA in history and women and gender studies at Pacific Lutheran University. Her dissertation, I think currently entitled The Flesh of the Facts Toward a Feminist Holocaust Consciousness, is analyzing the political and intellectual development of feminist Holocaust scholarship in the 1970s, 80s, and 1990s. And her special focus in this research is the very important work of and career of Joan Ringelheim. She already published on her research, and the first article appeared in Reflections, Auschwitz Jewish Center Annual Alumni Journal, which with the title "With Their Voices in Mind, Testimonies and Silences at Polish Holocaust Sites in 2019, and more specifically on her dissertation research. The first article is scheduled to appear in the Journal of Holocaust Research with the title "Asking About the Unspeakable, Joan Ringelheim and the Early Research About Sexual Violence and Same-Sex Practices Among Women During the Holocaust." She has already received numerous fellowships for her important research. And most recently, she received grants from the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University, and also from the Holocaust Educational Foundation at Northwestern University. So please give her a warm hand for her talk, Questions of Gender and Sexuality in Interviewer Trainings and Holocaust Survivor Testimonies.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to just keep my eye on the time for myself really quick, but I'm really excited to be here. I'm seeing a lot of names on Zoom, familiar faces here in person, mentors near and far. I've already seen one of my undergraduate advisors on the Zoom. So hi, Dr. Beth, and many more names that I'm thrilled to see. I want to thank the USC Shoah Foundation and the Center for Advanced Genocide Research for providing me the opportunity to engage in this fellowship and learn so much. Thank you to Wolf for the lovely introduction, very detailed introduction, and also Bedema and Martha. I also want to thank some other people who have been incredibly helpful during my time here, including Darren Eller and Crispin Brooks, Maya, and Yamor, who I just met very recently. All of you have made this experience incredibly welcoming and engaging and intellectually rigorous. And I want to have specifically on the record an extra special thank you to Martha, because when I arrived here, my Airbnb had almost no cooking supplies for me. And so she did the very life-saving act of kindness by sharing some cooking tools from her own home with me. So that needs to be on the record. Of course, also thanks to friends, family, mentors, like I said, far and wide. A special thank you to my friends Danielle and Kina for taking me away from listening to Holocaust testimony all day, every day, for a beautiful short visit at about the 3-week mark. So today I want to talk to you about what I've been doing during my month in residence here. I've been here since January 1st, and my research method has taken on some fascinating turns based on my use both of the testimonies in the Visual History Archive and also the USC Shoah Foundation's institutional archival materials. There's so much more to the VHA, so I'll talk about the Visual History Archive as the VHA from here on out. There's even more to it than I could have anticipated before coming on this trip, and I'm excited to share with you just scratching the surface of what I've learned in the month here. I also want to tell you that this is the very beginning of this work, so a lot of what I'm going to be saying are preliminary thoughts, many things to follow up on in the future, and I'm especially excited to hear your questions because of that point that I'm at in this work. Okay, here we go to the PowerPoint. Okay. Are we good on audio?
Did I hear feedback?
Yeah.
There was for a second.
Okay.
It's probably fine.
Bear with us with audio, both in person and on Zoom. Here is what I've been working on for the last month. I have been watching interviewer trainings from the 1990s, from the earliest trainings of the Shoah Foundation from the very beginning. Mostly I've been listening to the North American trainings, but there are numerous international trainings as well, as the Shoah Foundation team traveled around the world training interviewers in many countries. So I listened to as much of that as I could within the time span and within my own language limitations. I also started to listen to testimonies with interviewers who I was able to identify during those interviewer trainings, and tried to see how these interviewers might or might not have implemented certain aspects of their training into their interviewing strategies. I also utilized the documents of the pre-interview questionnaire, which was a document that a survivor and an interviewer would fill out before they engaged in the main interview process, and also studied how that document itself changed over time. And in some of the earliest cases, interviewers would also do a write-up of what the survivor's story was like. So it was interesting to see what gets included in that post-interview write-up and what doesn't get included. I also studied interviewer training materials, including the oral history manual that was circulated to interviewers in 1994, and various iterations of the Shoah Foundation's interviewer guidelines and topical questions lists. I also spoke with Paula Draper, who was one of the instrumental interviewer trainers during all of these trainings, who also conducted, I think, over 150 interviews with survivors herself. So in this presentation, like I said, I would like to share some of these preliminary thoughts I found watching these recordings of interviewer trainings, tell you what goes on in them. I've been told by some of the staff here that not a lot of people, if not, no one has really listened to these interviewer trainings since they were recorded in the 90s. So even though my focus is on gender and sexuality and sexual violence in particular, there's so much in those trainings left to be explored as well. So if you have broader questions during the Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about that. In an early conversation that I had with Wolf, we spoke about how the interviews themselves are time capsules in their own right of the moment that they were recorded. So this was something that I always keep in mind as I'm listening to Holocaust testimony, but the training itself was also a time capsule too. So what I'm going to try to share with you today are some of these preliminary answers to questions like, how did questions of gender and sexuality come up in these interviewer trainings? And how did they come up? Then how were those topics represented in the preparational materials for interviewers over time? Then how did the topics come up in the interviews? And how can we consider these testimonies as documents of the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s? An influential work for my work was Noah Shanker's Reframing Holocaust Testimony. This was a book that came out in 2015, and I encountered it in my first year of graduate school. And some of his frameworks have informed the way I approach this work ever since. And most importantly to me was Shanker's idea about testimonial literacy. And he defines it as, quote, an eye and ear for sensing the layers, ruptures, and tensions that mark the processes of giving and receiving accounts of the Shoah, unquote. This literacy included the ability to distinguish between different organizations' approaches to collecting Holocaust testimony. When I first started this research, I really dove into the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's oral history style, which we will get to the Joan Ringelheim connection quite soon because of that. Shanker also emphasizes that in the act of testifying to their experiences, they were performing their memory for the camera, for the interviewer. And it's important to pay attention to what he calls the off-camera dimensions of testimony. And the off-camera dimensions of testimony has essentially become my entire dissertation. So breaks in between the tapes, pre and post interview, meetings between interviewers and interviewees. And these sorts of connections actually inform a great amount of what I'll be speaking about today. So my dissertation, like Wolf said, focuses on Joan Ringelheim centrally and follows her career as she began as an independent scholar who was starting to ask questions about women's experiences during the Holocaust, and then later questions of gender and sexuality. And she also was hired at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1989 and worked in a number of capacities there. But most importantly to my work is her position as the director of the oral history department. So this is a picture of her here in 1983 at the Women Surviving the Holocaust Conference, where she and Esther Katz organized a large conference in New York City that drew together many women Holocaust survivors to speak about their experiences publicly, sometimes for the first time. In her first article on this topic, which was published in 1984, but was presented at conferences as early as 1981, The Unethical and the Unspeakable is what it's called. Ringelheim suggested that in testimonies of survivors, at that point she's really working with written testimonies and memoirs, the experiences of the Holocaust were condensed into what she called a universal framework, or a gender neutral framework, or a universal human perspective that did not allow for potential differences between men and women to be accounted for. She saw oral history as a path to begin collecting these types of stories. So between 1979 and 1984, Ringelheim conducted 20 interviews with women survivors. At this point, she had no formal training. So while I'm talking to you about interviewer training, at this point, she had no formal training. Many of these women were telling their stories for the first time. And as a result, Ringelheim's early interviews contain a distinctly collaborative and exploratory interviewer-interviewee dynamic. So what I found when I was applying for this fellowship was 5 of the women that Ringelheim interviewed between 79 and 84 were also interviewed by the Shoah Foundation in the 90s. So this is a really interesting point of contrast. Ringelheim was using an explicitly feminist framework when she collected these testimonies. And she asked women survivors about gender roles during persecution, romantic and strategic relationships, various forms of sexuality, sexual violence, rape, menstruation, pregnancy, and abortion. So when I listened to the interviews of these 5 women with Joan Ringelheim and the 5 interviews that the Shoah Foundation conducted, I was curious whether or not these topics came up in the same ways or not. For the most part, some of the most important moments having to do with, for example, sexual violence or abuse while in hiding, the women who brought those up to Joan did not bring those topics up in the Shoah Foundation. So I was curious to find the root of maybe why did they not bring it up here? And so I did approach this fellowship with some preconceived notions in mind that have been completely changed and blown up in the time that I've been here. So as I became very familiar with Ringelheim's approach, and then later USHMM's approach, because she was central in writing the documents that they used to train their interviewers, I became really interested in figuring out how this did or did not happen at the Shoah Foundation. In particular, although the event sheet says that I'm interested in going from the earliest point in 94 to the present, what I want to talk about today, for the most part, are some of the earliest interviews. One more of Joan later on at USHMM. Okay, so if you're on Zoom, you can scooch me over to make me bigger because I won't be using the slide for a second. So I will share some insights now from the interviewer training videotapes, mostly from the North American ones. The first, of course, happened in Los Angeles, but I also watched trainings from New York, Miami, Chicago, Philadelphia, and also Toronto. Toronto was the first international training that happened. Trainings occurred in other countries around the world, and most of them were presented both in English and also in the language of the country that they were presenting at. So there was a limited amount of those that I was able to listen to. On one of my first days of research here, I watched the first official training for the survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, which was at that point a single day event on July 7th, 1994. Even though Martha continually reminded me to get up and take breaks and go get lunch, I sat at my desk all day and watched the full training the whole way through. The urgency of the Shoah Foundation at that point was palpable. Most of the comments, the introductory comments, were about how the project was trying to gather these testimonies as fast as possible. They wanted to record as many testimonies as possible of as many survivors as we can as soon as possible. That was a direct quote. They also said things like, the window of opportunity is closing fast. We're racing to do this project. So you really get this sense of how much they wanted to record thousands of interviews as quickly as possible, especially when survivors were on the younger side compared to what we consider now. One of the primary and clearest concerns at this moment was combating Holocaust, what they called at the time revisionism, but what we would call denial. So one of the quotes from the training was, survivors' testimony is an essential element in maintaining a truthful first-person account of the Holocaust, unquote. Interviewers and the trainers saw this testimony as a direct way to combat this type of denial. They were also motivated, of course, like I said, by survivors soon passing away, and survivors as they aged were more willing to share their testimonies with their children and grandchildren, and eventually future researchers like many of us in the room. At this moment of intense desire to collect testimonies as fast as possible, members of the Shoah Foundation team were drawing on methodologies from a variety of existing Holocaust oral history projects around the country. But now they had the support, especially, of course, as everyone knows in this room, from Schindler's List and the increased interest at this moment. At the first training, we meet someone that if anyone else sits through these interviewer trainings, you will get to know Darlene Bosch very well. She led most of these trainings, and her background, her professional background, was that she was a therapist and a social worker, and she was a child of survivors who was very involved in second-generation organizations. So she really led the way through all of these trainings. The training would review the interview process. So what would happen before, during, and after the interview, what makes a good interview, and how to do the research before the interview. One of the things that I want to point out to all of us now is that one of the main pieces of preparation that the trainers provided with the interviewers was they often asked survivors, what are some of the main memories or the main stories that you want on tape? With the full knowledge that the tape, a copy of the tape, would be sent to their family. So this is important when we're thinking about gender and sexuality, right? So this is something that I really want us to keep in mind as I later describe some of these examples. The first interviewer training, I would say, was one that I found the most helpful for my purposes, because they took the time to go around the room and introduce every potential interviewer, and each potential interviewer stated their profession, their reason for being interested in interviewing Holocaust survivors, and what they were hoping to get out of the experience. And there's some really lofty goals at this point. One person thought that these tapes would save humanity, literally, was what was stated at this moment. So there was very expansive hopes and goals for these testimonies. And as these people are introducing themselves, we have many journalists, a lot of therapists, many of the interviewers, and this was something that I really focused on throughout the rest of my time here, were survivors themselves. Many were children of survivors. And so I tried to keep in mind, how did these types of professional and personal identities shift and change the ways that people approach this work? Okay. So one of the survivors who became one of the most prominent interviewers was named Renee Firestone. If you're familiar with the LA Holocaust Memorial scene, you'll be familiar with Renee Firestone. The reason I was able to pick her name out from the beginning was because she came and presented her testimony at my college when I was in undergrad. So we can maybe credit that for this line of inquiry from the beginning. She gave a presentation at that earliest training, and she talked about who are survivors. And she said interviewers needed to pay attention to where they came from. Were they from a city? Were they from a rural area? Were they religious or not religious? Were they poor? Were they rich? She said all of these facts made a difference, but notably she doesn't say, did they grow up a girl or a boy, or she didn't add that at that moment. Later on she did, but we can see from this early moment that that was not a part of the conversation. So Ringelheim's idea of this gender neutralness actually became pretty clear at this moment. As trainings continued, they became 3, 4, or 5 days long rather than just one, with many more trainers, many more presentations, and figures who were locally involved in Holocaust education and remembrance presented at these further trainings. Interviewer trainees started to do mock interviews, interview each other, practice interview survivors, and they would also watch clips together to assess the interviewer's approach and how they might do something differently. So through all of these trainings, we hear from Darlene Bosch, Paula Draper, Bonnie Gurewitch, Lanny Silber, who were all women who were involved in Holocaust oral history projects before. So one particularly important moment was at the first training in Toronto, which occurred in October 1994. This is where we meet Paula Draper for the first time, and we learn that Paula Draper is a historian. Part of her presentation was to share a bibliography of resources that interviewers could draw on. And one of them was the collection Different Voices, which was published in 1993. The book is broken down into 3 sections: voices of experience, voices of interpretation, and voices of reflection. And Ringelheim's most famous essay is included in that voices of reflection section. So Paula, for the first time in the context of the training itself, says, I will read a couple pages to you about issues of women and gender. And so she seems at this moment, in this first time that she's describing these issues, she says she doesn't want to take away from the Jewish aspect of persecution during the Holocaust, because that was a big point of contention at that point. But in the research at that time, she begins to explain, based on the research at that point in the 90s, right? So we can acknowledge that this has changed over time. But she explains, which sounds very dated to us now, and that's why I'm giving you these qualifications. But she said there were 4 ways that their experience differed. Women were deported directly to death camps because men's labor was seen as valuable. The second way that she said it might be different is women were often killed on arrival at camps. The third reason she listed was women were more vulnerable to sexual assault and exploitation, even by other prisoners, in ghettos and in hiding. And she said that Jewish women were responsible for children and the elderly, and she spoke a bit about forced abortions in camps and ghettos, making it more difficult for women to escape into forests or join the partisans, for example. So this is really the key moment that I see someone explicitly talking about these issues at the training. Throughout the rest of the training, we see a lot of questions that typically come from the prospective interviewers. They've asked, do men and women interview differently? They'll ask, are there any no-no questions? And the room kind of giggles. Like, what does she mean by no-no questions? After everyone stops giggling, she says, are you allowed to ask, were you raped? And so the room calms down, and a bunch of the people who are being trained say, no, you can't ask that. The reasoning was you need to ask an open-ended question. And then what happened? And then what happened? This was called a leading question. And trainers said that we can't tell people what happened to them. It would disqualify the authenticity of the tape if you explicitly asked that question. The survivor needed to volunteer the information. So I think that that's really key. At one of the trainings, when someone asked, do men and women interview differently? One of the trainers, who was a historian, he grinned and went, oh, wow, that's a loaded question. You should know that. And he then recommends Joan Ringelheim's article from Different Voices to kind of skirt around answering the question in a way. So we can see that even though Ringelheim was doing this work in the 80s, it was still controversial by this point in the 90s. There's more I could say about Bonnie Gurewitch and other people who started to talk about camp sisters and these sorts of issues that begin to emerge in the scholarship, but I'll have to save that probably for the Q&A if people want to make a note of that and ask questions. So when I encountered these questions from the prospective interviewers, does the sex of the interviewer make any difference? Do men and women interview differently? Would a survivor prefer a male interviewer or a female interviewer? These are all questions that interviewers asked. What became incredibly clear to me is that it was much more complicated than just the identity, gender identity, or how people present in these interviews, based on a variety of factors. One thing that I want us to note, this comes from the 2007 version of the interviewer guidelines. And so I'm showing you a jump between 2007 version of the interviewer guidelines and the 2020 version. Here it says, interviewers familiarize themselves with the interviewee's personal, religious, educational, and socioeconomic background, and their age also makes a difference. We don't see gender come into the interviewer training materials until the 2020 version. And what I want to talk to and make clear today is that it comes into the mix in the 2020 version, but this is where the bulk of the interviews are taken. So we have to consider that 1990s moment was really a window. And I'm thinking about what made it in and what didn't make it in. Of course, there's also so much that no one could have been trained for. There's a lot of reasons why even the trainings would be insufficient, because so many stories were being told by survivors for the first time. So I would like to show you a couple examples of what I mean when I say it's so much more than if the interviewer or interviewee is a man and a woman. It's so much more than the training materials, because what actually happens in the context of an interview relies on much richer connections that aren't evident from the VHA listing that I have here. So one of my first searches, and I hope you can indulge me in bringing you along with me on this kind of archival path that I followed. One of my first searches was in the 1994 interviews. In the VHA, you can limit your search to when interviews were conducted. So I wanted to see if I could find the interviewers from the trainings interviewing survivors and see what happens. I found about 20 interviews and 20 interviews that sexual violence is mentioned, for example. Okay, so I was searching specifically in this case for sexual violence. And the first time that I heard an interviewer themselves use the word rape was in this interview with Brigitte Medved. Okay, so Brigitte was a survivor who survived by hiding. And when she recounts the story of liberation by Soviet forces, she begins to talk about witnessing rape during liberation. So I'm going to play this clip, and I want you to pay attention to the way that the interviewer handles asking. And hopefully the audio is all right. We might in this room have to be a little quiet.
Hey, I come back and I hear screaming. I hear my mother is screaming.
Can we hear or no? Okay.
And I run up the stairs and there's one of the Russian soldiers attacking her, wanting to rape her. And I remember I started beating on him and I started yelling. And luckily, one of the officers came and pulled him away and really gave him a thrashing. Because every day, now you have to understand, I was 12 years old maybe. Behind the kitchen window of this house was an herb garden, a vegetable garden, big garden. Almost every day, the Russians would come with the motorcycles, with the girls, and rape. That's how I learned about sex. And so they.
Okay, the big moment. We have to fix the. Thank you, Roger. Okay.
Thought that they could get after my mother too. My mother was a beautiful woman. After this guy did this, that night we locked our door and we heard he came back. He sat outside that door the whole night, hoping and waiting that maybe we would come out. Anyway, so the Russians in those days weren't so wonderful. They had their own agenda.
Did
And
anyone
they
try
didn't care.
to rape you?
No. That's the strangest thing. They didn't try, nobody ever tried to come near me.
When did you find?
Okay. A lot of feedback here. I don't know if I totally messed it up. I hope people on Zoom can still hear. Okay. So we hear in this clip, Brigitte is talking about she saves her mother in this account. And so very quietly, I don't know if we heard it, but the interviewer asks, did anyone try to rape you? And this is the first time, this is the earliest moment that I was able to find that the interviewer asks this question, asks, were you raped? And she says no. So maybe I won't show you these testimony clips because of the issues here, but so when we look at the VHA listing, we see the interviewer's name, and the interviewer's name is Dana Schwartz. Dana Schwartz, she was at the first ever training, and Dana Schwartz was a child survivor of the Holocaust. And Dana Schwartz was a therapist for about 30 years. So I searched Dana Schwartz in the VHA. She conducts over 100 interviews, something to that effect. But I also found her interview as well. She was interviewed by another name that I've brought up before, Renee Firestone, who's also a woman survivor. In this interview, Dana recounts her own experience of, in her words, saving her mother from rape by a Russian soldier. So you see these two survivors, Brigitte and Dana. They were around the same age, only 2 years different. And they both have these similar stories about witnessing rape or attempted rape during the liberation. And so you have to think, if you're listening to the interview and you don't have that context, there's a whole other dimension that we're not getting. Renee Firestone was an interviewer and an interviewee. So we see the slate card with Dana Schwartz listed as the survivor, Renee as the interviewer. And this was the time that the Shoah Foundation had the interviewer come around and identify themselves in front of the camera. So we actually see Renee and Dana side by side smiling at the camera, which I think is an important moment. Renee's interview is conducted by another survivor named Cy Frumkin. And in this interview, Cy asks her pretty bluntly, and if you didn't know this context, he asks, were you raped by the Russian liberators? And if I was listening to this testimony without having the context that I'm giving you now, I would have thought, oh my gosh, he asked that pretty bluntly, right? But when you do a quick Google search, and if you're aware of the LA Holocaust Remembrance scene, which I was not aware of before I came here, Renee and Cy were friends for decades and decades before this interview. Renee is interviewed. Look at the background. And then Renee interview Cy back to back. Okay, so we're going to try the audio. I just am aware that we are low on time. Okay. All right. So I'm going to keep going without the clips, but if you want the clip information, you can ask me for it. Okay. So one other example of kind of an atypical VHA searching experience that I had came up when I was also searching for liberator sexual assaults. So before I move on from this one really quick, I want to say it's clear it's not just about a man interviewing a woman. It's not just about a woman interviewing a woman. It's a woman Holocaust survivor interviewing a woman Holocaust survivor. It's a friend interviewing a friend. It's someone who had almost a very similar experience of saving their mother from rape during liberation. It's much more than just that dynamic alone. So while I was also searching for liberator sexual assaults, I found the testimony of Rochelle Goldman Miller. She spent most of the war in France. She lost both of her parents, her brother and her sister, and 93 extended relatives in total. 3 days before roundups in Paris, her mother sent her to hide on a Catholic family's farm. She recounted in this testimony a major part of her story, where she was adopted after the war's end by an American soldier who happened to also be Jewish. And he brought her from France to the United States, and she lived with him at 14 years old. Now, this might sound like a story of liberation, but as I've already told you, I found it under the label liberator sexual assaults. And she shares in the testimony that he abused her sexually from France into the United States. His wife found out and she was kicked out of the house. And as a 14-year-old survivor now in New York City, she moves from 5 different foster homes at that moment. So this is a moment that sort of pushes against this liberation narrative. She comes to New York City, and there's this very different element to the story that she now tells publicly to school groups. It's not something that she is leaving out of the narrative. But one detail that I wanted to point out, if you can see the pin on her shirt, it says AIDS Walk, Los Angeles. Okay. This interview was also conducted in 1994. And so again, we don't have the same type of, and now I have kids and I have grandkids, because she opens up at the end of the testimony about how one of her sons died from AIDS 2 years before this interview was conducted. I have found examples before when survivors are talking about issues in their more current life that get diverted or slowed down or kind of shut down. In this case, the interviewer, who I've not been able to fully identify their full background, the interviewer allows her to talk about her son for almost a full 20 minutes. And so she speaks about how she very tearfully says to the camera, "This was my second Holocaust." And so now at this moment when scholars are talking about remembrance of the Holocaust, I'm thinking of Jake Newsom's book, Pink Triangle Legacies, coming out in the shadow of the Holocaust. We see for this survivor, in her mind, 2 Holocausts in her words. And the interviewer takes this term as she expressed it herself and asks her for her message to future generations based on this tragedy in her life. And she talks, like Wolf said in the beginning, the mission about promoting tolerance and thinking about other instances of other instances of genocide, other instances of mass death, she makes comments about how people need to be thinking more expansively about these problems throughout the world. So this was a moment where in the VHA, we actually have quite an extensive account of a different type of second generation, her son, Mark, who was lost in 1992. Interestingly enough, at the end of the interview, as we know that the VHA interviews have photos from the survivor's life, she also included her son's quilt, which I was moved to see included because it might not always be considered part of her Holocaust narrative, but this was part of her narrative. So this was another aspect of an unexpected moment in the archive related to gender and sexuality, but maybe not in the ways that we would anticipate. Okay. So I will wrap up with a couple extra comments about how I found numerous examples of survivors bringing up a variety of topics that scholars are interested in, bringing up their dating and love lives, bringing up boyfriends and girlfriends, love, sexual activity of all kinds, same-sex sexual activity, coerced sexual activity, pregnancy, abortion, all different kinds of stories. I found multiple accounts of men disclosing sexual abuse or coercion by other men. And in most of these cases, the survivor was volunteering this information rather than being prompted by the interviewer. So when I came in thinking it's all about the questions, it's all about the questions, it's really more about that I found what was on the table of an acceptable topic to talk about within the context of a Holocaust narrative. If the survivor decided to volunteer this information, did the interviewer dart the other way and ask about something else? Did they ask a follow-up question? Did they allow some space for the survivor to talk about it or not? And some of these strategies evolved over time. So when researchers talk about a USC Shoah interview, it really actually does make a huge difference if it was conducted in 94 or 98 or 2000. And it really does make a difference if an interviewer, if it's their first or if it's their 128th, okay? And so these are just some initial thoughts, but when we think about gender and sexuality and sexual violence in the context of the Shoah Foundation and in the context of the VHA, there are so many more local stories. Today, I've only really focused on LA specific stories that are left there to be found by researchers moving forward. One of the things that I would like to conclude with, someone once asked, how could you include these topics, particularly sexual violence, without being invasive or too, I keep using the word blunt, but too explicit about it. And I think the most important part in 2023 is that instances of sexual violence, but also sexuality more broadly, they are embedded in survivors' narratives of the Holocaust. And they found themselves feeling compelled to testify to these experiences. And you have to be paying attention to if interviewers were willing to meet them where they were. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carli. And again, we invite questions, obviously, here in the room, which Carli, do you feel comfortable just calling on people in the room?
Sure. And
then also on Zoom, you can use the chat, the Q&A feature at the bottom or the raise hand button, and we will integrate your questions with the discussion that's happening in the room too.
Sarah, go for it.
So first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It's given me a lot to think about. I had two questions. One, I was wondering when you were looking at the trainings, if there is an impact on the location in the city, like if certain things are brought up, for example, knowing the focus on LA and thinking about that, where there are certain political issues that were impacting the way that trainings were being presented there versus in Philly or in Chicago. And then the second question is, this might be outside the scope of your research, but in thinking about other victim groups alongside Jewish victims during the Third Reich. So, for example, in the interviews of Sinti and Roma, or Jehovah's Witnesses, or gay men persecuted, if you had a chance to look at some of those, and if those trainings fell under the same, or if that's a project for another scholar to look at. So
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'll start there because those are two wonderful questions. One of the things that I would like to emphasize is that there are all of these local stories. Like if someone is interested in institutional histories about what is going on in Chicago, what is happening in Toronto, what is happening in New York, there are many location-specific stories to tell. Not only with contemporary political issues, and one thing that I could give a whole second presentation about is people were bringing up the Bosnian and Rwandan genocides at these trainings. They were bringing up racism in the United States in these trainings. One of the trainings that I found incredibly interesting was a training that was specific for Orthodox Jews in New York City. And that takes on a religious component with Yafa Eliach and Bonnie Gurewitch talking about specifically religious issues that come up. And in one of these moments, Yafa Eliach tells a story that one of the survivors that she interviewed in the 60s talked about. As a woman, she hiked up her skirt a little bit to gain a passport to escape. So this is at an Orthodox specific training. And the child of that survivor did not want that story on the record. Please erase the tape, get rid of it. And Yafa says, if it wasn't for the skirt raising, we wouldn't be talking right now. So that is like a very specific type of moment that has a lot of other dimensions. So there's a lot more to answer about that. The other thing I will say is that I spent a day listening to interviews with Nanjing massacre survivors, which was a partnership with the USC Shoah Foundation, and rape is explicitly asked about in those interviews. So that might not be the different victim group that you're asking about right now. I haven't had a chance to listen to interviews with Roma and Sinti, for example, who's labeled as homosexual in the archive, for example. I haven't gotten there yet. But so those types of differences, especially within this interviewing structure. When I say we've kind of missed this window for the 2020 version, we haven't missed the window for, say, Rwandan genocide survivors, for example. So that's a preliminary answer to your great question.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question about the indexing terms that you use to do your research.
Yeah.
Are there any indexing terms as a scholar, that you would recommend that would further clarify the kind of research that you're doing?
A big one that I would love to see, inspired by Anna Haikova's work, would be sexual barter. I feel like that's become such an important term in the scholarship about strategic relationships in the ghettos especially. And I think there were times where maybe like sexual coercion would have been the search term that comes up in the index. But that would be one example that comes to mind. One other suggestion that I came up with was there's an indexing term called courtships. But a synonym, so within the VHA, when you're searching, there's the indexing term, and I learned a lot of this from Darren from showing me how this works. And then there's synonyms that bring you to a similar search result. It would be great, I think, if boyfriend and girlfriend maybe were more searchable. I don't know if that's off base. The other thing that, again, might not necessarily fit into the index with what our focus is on, I never would have come across this story about Rochelle and her son, Mark, because that's not a search term. And I'm not suggesting that you add that to the index, but that's just an example of one of the stories that I wouldn't have found. If
You're referring to AIDS?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And we can talk more about that because I have other ideas as well. So those are a couple examples.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much.
This may tie into the discussion of the index aspect, and I've been double teaming, so if this has been already answered, apologies. But this is from Rachel, and she asks, did the terms the VHA use like limit the research? Thinking about the terms currently being used, for example, like homosexual is a catch-all term for those who would now claim as LGBTQ plus folks, but having the term lesbian have helped your research. And also, did you find that survivors discussed, sorry, actually, let's stick to that first question.
Did you find survivors discussed homosexuals differently than they discussed lesbians? That was the second part of her question.
Yeah, this was something that, again, I'm starting to think about. I don't feel like I can give a big answer because there's a limited amount that I listened to. But when I did search the search term lesbians, for example, I've read Anna Haikova write a lot about homophobia or lesbophobia that comes through in these testimonies before. And I will say I did encounter that when I was searching by that search term. But of course, the other element that is part of this question is that there's so much that I probably missed because I was searching by search term. Sometimes when you're looking at the segments in the VHA, there are many sections that don't have a search term. And in those sections were sometimes the ones where I found these descriptions. Differences between homosexuals and lesbians, yes, there were differences. There were differences to that. And I would need to draw from my memory bank some specific examples to answer it sufficiently. But one of the other things I would want to say about that in the index, I'm losing my train of thought. Is there part of the question that I didn't answer there about differences in how people recounted?
Like, would the term lesbian have helped the kind of language that's used?
Well, I think one of the components that I wanted to answer is that lesbian might not be the most accurate descriptor in a lot of cases. I saw a lot of cases of sexual abuse by a woman or girl labeled as lesbian, and there's a variety of reasons that's a problem. So I think same-sex sexual coercion or something like that would be an important shift in that regard. So that was one aspect of using the index to do these types of searches. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your really fascinating presentation. I was wondering, there are two components to my question. One is, as a museum educator, Holocaust museum educator, based on your research, how do you use the information that you've researched and gained to memorialize these Holocaust survivors and victims? And second question, any research that you had a chance to do in any other language than English? And do you happen to know if there is a research about the first transport to Auschwitz that happened in 1942, in March 1942, mostly single women?
My language is quite limited. Sometimes if I was listening to interviews in a different language, I was also reliant on the, what is that word? Translation. So I think with the search terms, there is a way to search specifically, and I'm looking at the people working with the thesaurus and indexing. I think there is a way to search that specifically for maybe that transport, but that's not something that I knowingly came across. In terms of educational materials, one example that comes to mind is that just 2 days ago, I watched a documentary that the survivors of the Shoah Visual History Project produced. The producers of the project produced this documentary called, I think it was called Survivors of the Holocaust. It won a Peabody Award. And interposes originally composed music and archival photos and videos and the survivor testimony, many that came from that 1994 window of time that I was looking at. And sex and sexuality and sexual violence did not come up. And so all of these interviews were kind of spliced together, trying to communicate the narrative of the Holocaust. And so you see those moments, if you search for the people included in the documentary, many of them did talk about sexuality related issues, but they were not included as part of the clips. So one of the things that I would recommend, where possible, in educational settings, trying to find ways to include issues related to gender and sexuality in ways that don't seem outside of the narrative. A lot of the survivors, when they talked about specifically sexual violence, and I don't want to only talk about sexual violence, but the interviewer would ask, is there anything else that you didn't share? And one of the women went, yes, and then recounts this story of sexual assault. And so I think by finding a way to try our very best, it's very difficult work to integrate these issues rather than have them seem separate or a different topic. That would be one recommendation. I might have more specific recommendations soon enough, but that's what comes to mind now. Adama.
Thank you, Carli. You know, I love your project. It really gives us so much insights about everything that comes into play when it comes to oral history testimony. So you mentioned that you started with USHMM, and obviously John Ringelheim was involved in both projects, projects at both USHMM and the Shoah Foundation at some point. So I'm wondering about the differences in approaches and what you encounter in testimonies recorded by USHMM or other collecting bodies like the Fortuna, for example, and then the Shoah Foundation testimonies that you did research on this last month.
Yeah, I think that is such an important question. And one of the key things is there's even a difference between interviews conducted by Joan in the 80s when she was not affiliated with a specific institution, and then when she was affiliated with USHMM. So even that is a difference that I've had to trace in addition to the different institutional approaches. One of the things that I have found to be distinct about USHMM's oral history guidelines, for example, is that Joan's interviews from the 80s directly informed the way that she wrote the questions lists for USHMM. So gender is incorporated from the jump in their interviewer guidelines, rather than having it come into the conversation quite a bit later. So this is one of those aspects of kind of cross-institutional collaboration that might not have come to fruition. I don't have the explicit answers to the extent that the Shoah Foundation was in touch with Joan at that time. But there are moments where Joan Ringelheim and people that she interviewed seem to be more comfortable with asking these sorts of questions from a similar moment that the Shoah Foundation interviews are happening, which tells you a little bit about the behind the scenes that might have happened. Were there any online, Maya, that you wanted to ask?
A little bit of a queue. Let's see. I have a question from Marcy Bloom. Thank you, Carli. Very powerful. Your research is groundbreaking. I performed Holocaust survivor interviews for the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle. Has the more current Me Too movement impacted the willingness, even more openness to discuss sex crimes against women, children, and men?
I would say almost a resounding yes. I've found a number of examples of the Me Too movement being influential in the ways that these conversations are happening. One of the key findings of my dissertation research is that Ringelheim's interest in second wave feminist interviewing strategies, or not interviewing strategies alone, but political organizing strategies like consciousness raising, which has interesting connections to the Me Too movement, allowed survivors to think that these topics were on the table to be spoken about at this early moment. So I would say that I have seen survivors reference the Me Too movement when they're starting to include these parts of their stories more publicly.
There's a comment by Esther Finder, who's in the chat, and she writes, I may be the only person who did interviews for both the USHMM with Joan and the Shoah Foundation. I did an interview with a rape survivor for the Shoah Foundation. She did the interview on the condition that she only admit to being an eyewitness, not the victim. Thank you for talking about Joan Ringelheim. I worked with her for years at the USHMM, and I am glad her work is being acknowledged.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I have had a number of people talk about interviewing after being trained by Joan and working with Joan, and I love those sorts of insights. So thank you for that comment.
I just want to make a comment. I just want to thank you so much. I've been waiting 10 years for somebody to watch that first interview or training tape. It tells, I don't know how much it helped you in your specific line of questioning, but it does tell you a lot about the Shoah Foundation and the beginnings of the Shoah Foundation. So I'm so happy that you watched it, and you know, there's lots more in that institutional archive if anyone's interested.
I'm so glad I watched it too. I was truly could not be moved from my desk, especially during that first one. And I will add that I spoke on the phone with Paula Draper, who you connected me with, for almost 2 hours. And there's even more institutional memory stories that probably have yet to be collected. I started listening to some institutional memory interviews, particularly with Ari Zev, but there's much more that I'm sure could be collected. And I was honored to be the one to listen to that first training. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent presentation. Thank you. I was curious, thinking about movements like Me Too or reparations, which have kind of a cultural awareness perspective, and then also a legal component where sometimes there's cases that come out of it back. Do you have any thoughts on if something like that should happen, against some of the governments and the soldiers that have done this?
Something like what should happen?
Like claims filed against them for some of these cases that may not have come up in or already. In a way like Me Too and reparations for slavery, similar.
That is such an interesting question and definitely out of my area of expertise. I think I would say that it would be really up to the people testifying to their experience about whether or not they would want to pursue those types of cases. There's the thing that is related to my work is in the 1990s, a lot of feminist lawyers were using information about rape during genocide and the Holocaust to create new laws about genocide or rape as an aspect of genocide or a tool of genocide. So that's the example I'm most familiar with, but I think that's a really great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to say your presentation was super moving. I'm a student in Professor Wolf's class, and my question was just about the authenticity of some of the tapes. So in the example you use with Bridget Menvin in her 1994 interview, when she was directly asked if she was raped, does that invalidate the interview, or was that
No, I disagree. I totally disagree that invalidates the interview. I actually think that's such an important question, especially if it's asked in a way that is Dana asked it very calmly and quietly. It is a little bit different than a more kind of accusatory tone. So no, I think that makes the
and then
all the more valuable.
Wasn't in trouble or anything because it wasn't open-ended necessarily.
No, and I will say that the openness to asking those types of questions greatly increased as things went on, especially as survivors were talking about these topics. It became indisputable that these things happened. And so I would say that the Shoah Foundation was incredibly flexible with things moving forward, especially as the initial race to collect all the interviews, that moment sort of passed in a way.
Thank you.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Maya. Oh, and then Wolf, sorry.
Yeah. So I'm seeing two questions here that kind of deal with two different areas of history and violence. So we have a question from Regina Moonweiser Thank you for your rich and thought-provoking presentation. My question, were interviewers in the 1990s also aware of the comfort women survivor testimonies in Asia? Your analysis reminds me of Hwana Liang's work on finding the map of memory of survivors of military sexual slavery by Japan. She relates from her experience as an interviewer that it was her inability to hear what the women were saying that facilitated the way in which they talked or remained silent. So we have kind of a question comment about that as well from Julie HW. Hi, Carli, thank you. I'm at the University of Leicester in the UK studying how women articulate their experiences of sexual violence in the Rwandan genocide. And I've noticed that the interviewer / narrator positionality is affected by factors such as age differentials. Is that something you've noticed? Could comment on? So two different questions, but kind of looking at comparative like studies.
Yeah. For Regina's question, I haven't found explicit mention of comfort women in the survivor testimonies, but there was a really interesting video included in the institutional materials about Lanny Silver, who was a feminist, and if you look her up, she was very involved in activism work, and she founded a Bay Area Holocaust oral history project, and she worked incredibly closely with a oral historian who interviewed, for example, like Japanese survivors of Japanese internment camps, and so questions of this kind of cross, even though that's not directly related to comfort women, that is something that came up in one of the very first trainings. So I can't answer your question directly. I haven't seen examples of it in my work so far, but if I do, I'll reach out to you. And I'll definitely look into this work about finding the map of memory of survivors of sexual slavery in Japan. A question about Rwandan survivors' age differential. There is, again, another interesting video of an interviewer debrief with survivors of the Shoah Foundation interviewers. And they talk at length about the age differential, saying, I'm a young person, this survivor thinks that there's no way I could understand. And so I'm sure that that might be a factor coming into play. All these aspects of the interviewer-interviewee dynamic and how they interact with each other, I think are totally up for this type of methodological analysis. Wolf, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Carli. Really fantastic. And I'm wondering, so when we think about kind of the development of attention to this topic of sexual violence, so you mentioned strongly this the lack of attention in the beginning of gender at all, right? I wonder, was there any pushback kind of resulting from lack of knowledge regarding the Holocaust? For example, there was this very strange idea that there could not have been rape because there were the Nuremberg race laws, which was total bullshit, because there were laws about murder also, and nobody cared, right? So, I mean, but was there something like this coming from this lack of knowledge at the time?
I can answer that question mostly in terms of my Ringelheim research rather than Shoah Foundation research. At that conference that I spoke about, the 1983 conference, some of the women survivors there said, Jewish women were so lucky because of the Rassenschande laws. We weren't raped because of the racial purity laws. And other survivors said, no, I saw it happen with my own eyes. And so this exchange was a moment where they're saying, no, that is a myth. German soldiers did rape Jewish women. And so in 1983, that's a moment of contestation of trying to dispute that type of mythologization. One interesting thing is when I was doing an interview with Pip from the communications team here, he asked about interviews of the 1940s and if these topics came up then. I went to the David Boder interviews that are available online for those of you who are interested. Survivors were talking about it explicitly. Those Rassenschande laws didn't mean anything. German guards were raping Jewish women and killing them in the ghettos. And so I came away with a new idea of the complexity of how this myth changed over time. And then in the Shoah Foundation interviews, women are testifying to German guards attempting to assault them or rape them at different moments.
Unfortunately, we have to conclude in a couple of minutes because it's about that time. So I'm going to throw a few questions at you from Zoom.
Okay.
Do you have a pen?
Yeah, I have one.
Take notes.
Mm-hmm.
So Atina Grossman asks, I would be very curious about your sense of balance in those survivor testimonies you've studied in regard to sexual violence by liberators, particularly Soviet troops, versus situations during the war, whether by perpetrators, rescuers, co-persecutees, to use all that inadequate naming. And thank you so much. So that's
okay, go ahead.
And then Marissa Fox-Bevilacqua asks, I find it a bit dubious that the reason given for not including rape as an explicit question was that it was a conversation closer. Certainly, there were many issues that could have fallen into that category, yet only rape was relegated to other status. It may not have prevented someone from bringing it up if she wanted to, but it did relegate it to outside the narrative and must have impacted how those stories are told. Did you find that to be true? And what about the follow-ups? To Marissa, the follow-ups seem lacking. And then just one more quick question and possibly quick answer. Will Jones from the University of Oxford says, hi, Carli. On the question of authenticity, how do you handle more general criticism about experiences of sexual violence in oral history projects? Like questioning the authenticity of a survivor who may be adjusting their narrative to erase more consensual encounters to avoid shame, for example. He's a PhD student at Oxford who's studying sexual violence against men and boys during the Holocaust.
Okay. So like super lightning round through these questions. Tina, lucky for us, I have a lot of thoughts on this question and I would love to talk to you more about it next time we see you, because that was something that I started to take note of, not only in the interviews, but also in the indexing. So liberator sexual assaults is a specific indexing term, for example. I'm wondering if the searchability factor might have influenced the ways that I am able to research these things. And when I have more time, if I can see kind of the balance of liberator sexual assaults versus all these other terms that you mentioned, that is something enormous. One example, a survivor testified to being raped by Russian soldiers and then said, and I was also a German soldier tried to rape me too earlier. So these kinds of connections are being made. Rape being the one outside of the narrative. Yes, there are so many other examples outside of the topics that I focused on today that are also given similar treatment. Something that I was paying attention to as well, and would love to have a more well thought out question, but I'm keeping an eye on the clock. Please email me if you want to correspond about it more. And then the final question was about
authenticity in general,
yeah.
About people changing their stories.
Well, I mean, one of the biggest issues is people saying, I witnessed something happening. This is something that scholars have confronted for decades now. If a woman was not willing to claim an experience as her own, but might have put it on the record as witnessing someone else, that's an issue that I confronted many times over time. But also men accounting to sexual abuse and violence takes on another dimension, especially as interviewers become more comfortable with asking questions about their experiences too. I'll have to leave it there in the interest of time, but again, I think my email is probably easily available, so anyone can feel free to email me if you have more questions. Thank you so much.
So much, Carli. It was incredible. And just so for the people whose questions were not answered. We apologize about the time constraint, and we're sharing all the questions in chat with Carli so that she can follow up individually. And please join us for our next lecture next Thursday, February 9th at noon about Indigenous resistance and collective memory in Guatemala. Thank you again for being here.
Hi, everyone. As I'm sure you saw in the recording, we had some technical difficulties with playing the clips. So Martha and I decided to re-record this segment of the talk just to be able to present the clips to you. And so I will explain what I might have already explained in the lecture a bit, but in more depth and aided by the clips themselves. So we're jumping back into a part of my research that I've done during my time here when I was searching for some of the earliest mentioned instances of sexual violence in the VHA. So I was searching between the dates June or July 1994 until December 1994. And the first time that I heard an interviewer explicitly use the word rape and ask a survivor directly if she had been raped was this interview you see on screen here with Brigitte Medvin. Brigitte had spent the war disguised as a non-Jewish girl. And at this point in the testimony, she's recounting that she had been recently reunited with her mother in Germany. And they had been staying at an estate there, and the Russian forces were approaching. So many people started to leave the village, but Brigitte's mother insisted that they stay because they were finally free after the war. When the Russian forces came through the village, this is the portion of the testimony with Brigitte that you're about to hear. And I'll turn off my camera for this segment.
The next day, I had been out playing somewhere. I come back and I hear screaming. I hear my mother is screaming, and I run up the stairs, and there's one of the Russian soldiers attacking her, wanting to rape her. And I remember I started beating on him, and I started yelling. And luckily, one of the officers came and pulled him away and really gave him a thrashing. Because every day, now you have to understand, I was 12 years old, maybe. Behind the kitchen window of this house was an herb garden, a vegetable garden, big garden. Almost every day, the Russians would come with the motorcycles with the girls and rape the girls in that garden. And I watched them rape the women. That's how I learned about sex. And so they thought that they could get after my mother too. My mother was a beautiful woman. After this guy did this, that night we locked our door. And we heard he came back. He sat outside that door the whole night, hoping and waiting that maybe we would come out. Anyway, so the Russians in those days weren't so wonderful. They had their own agenda.
Did anyone try to rape you?
No, that's the strangest thing. They didn't try, nobody ever tried to come near me.
When did you find your father again?
So in this clip, we hear the interviewer quietly ask, did anyone try to rape you? And this was the first type of question of this sort that I had come across in the earliest interviews. So when I went back to the VHA description of the testimony, I noticed that the interviewer was Dana Schwartz, who I had encountered at the earliest Shoah Foundation trainings. And I knew from her introduction that she herself was a survivor. So I decided to search the VHA for her interview. And as you can see here, Brigitte was born in 1933. When we go to Dana Schwartz's interview, she was born in 1935. So a new type of story is emerging for me, that Dana Schwartz and Brigitte were both survivors born quite close to each other in time. And in Dana Schwartz's testimony, she also testifies to the experience of being a young girl during the liberation by Soviet forces. And so in this clip, we will hear Dana's perspective on a similar time.
Before we got out of Russia, there was an incident when my mother was almost raped, and I saved her. It's a long story, but a drunken officer was trying to have his way with her and was waving the gun, and I heard her scream for help, and I was in the manager's apartment where everybody was kind of huddling, and I asked the men to go and help her, and they wouldn't, so I went to help her, and I jumped on him from the back. You know, they have these leather straps that they wore like in an X, and I grabbed the X and I started to kick him and scratch his face, and he didn't know what hit him. And I said, "Run, mother, run." And he was waving his gun, and she said, "But you." I said, "Run, run." And she ran, and he was totally off his guard. He didn't know what had hit him. And then I jumped off and I ran.
So she goes on to say in this clip that she escaped as well. And this is a pivotal moment in Dana's testimony, because she goes on to immediately say that this is what motivated her mother ultimately to bring herself and Dana to the United States now that the war was over. So this interview with Dana sheds additional light on the interview that she conducted with Brigitte, because we can now imagine that as the interviewer, she was potentially more aware of the type of experience Brigitte was describing, because she had quite a strikingly similar experience in a totally different location in Poland, and Brigitte was in Germany, but a similar experience nonetheless. Then when we look at the interviewer for Dana Schwartz, we find Renee Firestone, who was another woman survivor. So I then looked up her testimony to see if she had memories of Soviet liberation. Before we move on, I'm showing the slate card from Dana Schwartz's interview. We see Dana Schwartz listed as the survivor, the interviewer listed as Renee Firestone. But if someone walked into the VHA and didn't know about this institutional context, they would not know that Renee herself was a survivor as well. And we see in the beginning of the testimony, the two of them introducing themselves in this screenshot here. In Renee's testimony, which was also recorded in 1994, the interviewer asked her as well if she was raped during Soviet liberation. Her story was quite different. You can see in the VHA description that Renee was quite a bit older than Dana and Brigitte. She was born in 1924. So toward the end of the war, she was in a smaller camp, and her experience of the Russian forces was quite different. The Russian officer who came in to initially speak to her and the other people at the smaller camp was actually Jewish, and he told them that the soldiers and the forces that would be entering this small camp would be, and these are her words, looting and raping. And he personally protected this small group of Renee and other women and told them when essentially the coast was clear. And she and her smaller group started to make their way back to her home in Czechoslovakia. And so this is the moment in which we find this clip.
And as we rode out for about 6 kilometers, a group of Russian soldiers stopped us. And I very cockily took the bumashka and showed them. And they smiled at us and they said, "Хорошо, okay," and took the bicycles. And we were on our foot walking through the
didn't try to
borders.
rape you?
No, they didn't. Apparently they must have, I mean, the way we looked, still with the shaved heads in this rag, I don't think we were too desirable.
Because you know, of course, that the Russians went through Germany raping everybody.
Absolutely. Later on, it was very dangerous for a young woman to be alone, or even a few women walking any place or being with around Russians. And again, I was very lucky because I had some very close calls.
So there you were on your way to Czechoslovakia.
So in this interaction, this is the first time we're hearing a man ask this question, and nobody tried to rape you. And had I not been in this mode of looking at who the interviewer was, I might have thought the way that the interviewer asked the question was a little intense. When we look at who the interviewer was, and I looked him up, Cy Frumpkin was also a very prominent survivor, very much involved in the LA Holocaust Memorial organizations in the area. And with a quick Google search, we learned that Renee Firestone and Cy Frumpkin were close friends working on these sorts of projects together for decades. So they were actually quite comfortable with each other. And we can maybe think about the way that Renee's expression looks quite comfortable in a new way when we know who her interviewer was to her. And when we look towards Cy's interview himself, Renee interviewed him. And if you look at the background, and if you listen to the in-between interviewing moments, we actually hear that Renee and Cy interviewed each other on the same day. So the reason I bring this string of description up is because it tells us that questions about, in this case, rape by Soviet forces takes on new dimensions when we think about survivors interviewing other survivors, especially based on their own contemporary knowledge and their own experience during the events. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you for being patient to see the full clips, and I'll sign off here.